Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about how China's GDP is now almost equal to the combined total of the G6 countries. On top of that, American media are reflecting on whether there's any point in still holding the G7, the group of 7 industrialized nations summit, because it feels like they're rolling out the red carpet to welcome Trump like he's Godzilla or something. No one could have predicted that the G7 summit held in Canada would end with US President Trump angrily lashing out at French President Macron. Trump only attended the G7 summit for one day on June 16th, left right after the dinner, and didn't even spend a night in Canada. French President Macron said that Trump left the G7 summit to return to Washington and push for a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. But Macron's statement ended up angering Trump. On the same day, Trump posted on his own social media platform, Truth Social, saying that publicity-seeking president of France, Emmanuel Macron, wrongly claimed that I attended the G7 summit in Canada so I could return to Washington to push for a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. Wrong. He has absolutely no idea why I'm actually going back to Washington right now. This definitely has nothing to do with a ceasefire. Whether it's intentional or not, Macron often gets things wrong. Trump said that his return to the US is for something far more significant than a ceasefire, and told everyone to stay tuned. Macron's political rival, Florian Philippot, leader of the French right-wing Patriots Party, commented that this was a total humiliation for Macron. Philippot posted that Macron really likes to act smart even when he knows nothing, he still has to speak up, and this time it totally backfired on him. Trump's furious criticism of Macron more or less shows that he really doesn't like the G7 setting, nor those European politicians who follow a so-called whitewashed path. Even US media are questioning whether there's any point in continuing the G7 at all. This year's 50th anniversary G7 summit kicked off in Canada. The host, Canadian Prime Minister Carney, was so worried about a repeat of Trump's famous storming out moment that he said not to clash with Trump, which actually became the main mission for the other 6 countries at this summit, leaving the US media sighing. On July 17th, Bloomberg published an article titled "The G7 was once a good idea, now it's G6 versus 1." The article was written by Bloomberg columnist Cruz, who opened with a rather painful question. He asked, as the former representative of the Western Bloc, has the G7 standard for a successful summit now been lowered to simply avoiding the American guests storming out in anger? This really makes people question the point of holding these meetings at all. Cruz said, from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, the world is currently facing numerous conflicts that urgently need to be resolved. But the leaders of the G7 countries can't even agree on how to interpret these conflicts, let alone come up with any solutions. For example, on the Middle East issue, French President Macron and others advocate for Israel to stop further escalating actions against Iran. On the other hand, Trump, although he wasn't happy to see Israel's attacks disrupt the US-Iran nuclear talks, now the conflict between Israel and Iran has already escalated. Trump, on the other hand, openly praised Israel's attack on Iran as outstanding, showing clear satisfaction. German Chancellor Angela Merkel also stood on Trump's side. During an interview, she strongly supported Israel's attack on Iran, saying that this was a dirty thing Israel did to all of us. However, Macron took a stance opposing Israel. He previously revealed that France plans to co-host an international conference with Saudi Arabia at the United Nations headquarters in June to promote the two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. During this period, France may officially recognize Palestine as a sovereign state. Meanwhile, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Huckabee, told Bloomberg that the United States no longer believes in the two-state solution. The G7 countries are each taking extreme positions on the Middle East issue, and when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine issue, the differences between Trump and the other G6 countries are even deeper. Trump once promised that if he returned to the White House, he would end the Russia-Ukraine conflict within a day. Now, it has been 5 months since he made that pledge, and there has been no new progress in the Russia-Ukraine peace talks for quite some time. Apart from Trump's wavering stance on aid to Ukraine, European countries have realized they must rely on themselves and take a tougher position. Since Trump started his second term, he has already clashed either directly or indirectly with many world leaders. Among the foreign leaders attending this G7, both Ukrainian President Zelensky and South African President Ramaphosa have previously been victims of Trump's reality show-style ambushes. Zelensky and Trump had a heated argument in front of the media at the White House, getting into a big row. As for South African President Ramaphosa, Trump played a so-called video of white people being massacred right in front of him at the White House. At this summit, the host country's Prime Minister, Canada's Carney, managed to wrap up his visit to the White House relatively unscathed. But the main reason he was able to get elected was largely because he promised to resist Trump's ridiculous threats to turn Canada into the 51st state of the US. Another interesting episode at this summit was that Macron, in order to support Denmark and prevent Trump from taking away Denmark's autonomous territory, Greenland, deliberately chose to enter Canada via Greenland. Maybe that's why Trump wanted to lash out at Macron. Bloomberg's article further pointed out that, most importantly, all of this happened against a crucial backdrop. Trump had already launched a tariff war against all his trading partners. The deadline for negotiations between various countries and the Trump administration is next month on the 9th. According to Bloomberg, all of this feels like déjà vu. After all, back in 2018 during Trump's previous term, Canada also had a G7 summit thrown into chaos by Trump. At that time, Trump refused to sign the joint communiqué and angrily called then Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau hypocritical and weak. However, in the view of Bloomberg article's author Cruz, if that G7 summit could still be seen as an accidental diplomatic blunder rather than the beginning of this loose international organization's decline, now, that explanation is getting harder and harder to believe. A Canadian official even told the Financial Times recently that holding a G7 summit these days is like rolling out the red carpet for Godzilla. Haas admitted that no one expects the G7 meeting to reach any practical or feasible outcomes on real issues. In fact, Canadian Prime Minister Carney even cancelled the usual practice of issuing a joint communiqué at the end of the summit. On the night of June 16th, Trump left the summit a day early, citing the situation in the Middle East as the reason. Haas said that looking back at history, the G7 was born in the 1970s. It originally emerged as a result of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the oil crisis, and stagflation, when Western countries wanted to coordinate their internal positions on major economic and strategic issues. Later on, it became what the West considered the core of global governance. But from Brexit to Trump's aggressive approach, the so-called Western values that the G7 has always emphasized are no longer unified among its member countries. Haas believes that the fundamental reason for the G7's existence has also disappeared as a result. In addition, the analysis from Nikkei and Bloomberg is also quite similar. On June 15th, on the eve of the G7 summit, he published an article analyzing that the G7's role as a global rulemaker is steadily weakening, which is closely related to the continuous decline in the G7's strength and influence. This is also an important reason why Trump now looks down on the G7. Nikkei reported that the key reason behind the formation of a G6+1 pattern within the G7 is the ever-widening economic gap between the United States and the other 6 countries. According to calculations by the International Monetary Fund, the combined share of the G6 countries in global GDP has plummeted from 35% in 2000 to just 18% in 2024, which is almost cut in half. Among them, Japan's decline is the most significant, dropping from a 15% share of the global total in 2000 to only 4% in 2024. In contrast, the US share has been relatively stable, dropping from 30% of global GDP in 2000 to 26% in 2009. If we only look within the G7, the US share actually increased from 46% in 2000 to 59% in 2009. According to Nikkei's report, Japan has been dragged down by long-term economic stagnation and issues of a declining and aging population, which are also the main reasons for the drop in GDP share among the G6 countries outside the US. In other words, Japan has been left behind by its neighbors. At the same time, new economies like China are rising rapidly. According to Nikkei's report, with its abundant labor resources, China has become the world's factory and achieved rapid growth that has surpassed Japan. Last year, China's GDP accounted for 17% of the global total, almost matching the combined total of the G6 countries. Note that this comparison is based only on nominal GDP in US dollars. If we calculate GDP using the more accurate purchasing power parity, China already surpassed the US back in 2014. Nikkei News pointed out that within the international framework dominated by developed countries like the US and Europe, emerging countries are increasingly dissatisfied that their voices are not being respected. In recent years, the BRICS mechanism, led by China, Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa, has been growing stronger and stronger. In January last year, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, Iran, and Ethiopia officially became members of the BRICS countries. This round of expansion has doubled the size of the BRICS countries, turning it into a powerful economic bloc with a combined GDP of $28.5 trillion, accounting for 28% of the global economy. The total population of its members has reached 3.5 billion, making up 45% of the world's population, and their combined crude oil production also accounts for 44% of the global total. Nikkei says that as many countries begin to establish complex multilateral relationships with nations outside the G7, the era of the G7 as a world leader is coming to an end. The report borrows a concept from a Eurasia Group report earlier this year, saying that we are now in the era of G0. It can be summed up like this. First, the G7 summit is like rolling out the red carpet to welcome Trump, the Godzilla. The 7 countries don't see eye to eye and are at odds with each other. No one really knows what this meeting is for. Second, the reason behind this is that Trump is taking a new isolationist path, making decisions on his own, and has no interest in joint action with the other 6 countries. Third, China's GDP is now almost equal to the combined total of the G6, and together, the GDPs of China and the US account for 43% of the world's total. No wonder Trump thinks that as long as China and the US agree on something, they can basically call the shots. Also, on Pomegranate Channel's Current Affairs Quick Commentary, I'll talk about how the UK had to give in the terms of the trade agreement it signed with the US, including the annual quota limiting UK car exports to the US to 100,000 vehicles. The UK really made a lot of concessions. Subscribers are welcome to tune in to Pomegranate Channel to hear my commentary.